The book begins with a narrative about Rachel, the author's daughter, disappearing. The author, Peter Hotez, explains that this happens a lot and is common of children with autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Hotez then goes on to explain how Rachel's impulsive behaviors affect the life of his family, often leading to neglect of the other children and a constant stress that takes a toll on everyone involved. He then shifts his focus to how he got his start in science. Dr. Hotez, then just Peter, was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and always had a passion for science, especially microbes. As an undergraduate at Yale University, he studied African tympanosomes and the immune human response to them under Professor Frank Richards. Hotez then completed his MD-PhD at Rockefeller University, where he met his wife, Anne. Over the next few years, Dr. Hotez would have 2 children and return to Yale for a postdoctoral fellowship in pediatric infectious diseases and molecular parasitology. His daughter Rachel was born in 1992. There was nothing particularly eventful about her early childhood, but soon she would be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, at the time known as pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. After this introduction to his chaotic family and professional journey, he briefly discusses the goals and themes of the book as a whole, saying, "This book is about my passion for science and the science of vaccines, juxtaposed with the pseudoscience of a robust, well-organized, and often aggressive anti-vaccine movement in the United States. It's about Rachel, from a parent's point of view. I am a pediatrician, a scientist, and Rachel's father, and I can tell you unequivocally that vaccines do not cause autism." Chapter 2 briefly explains Dr. Hotez's own experience with vaccine research and development, but quickly shifts to a discussion about the success of American vaccines. Dr. Hotez was a pediatrician during a time in the 1980s when invasive Haemophilus influenzae type B, or HIB, took the lives of 60,000 children a year. This number shifted during that time to only about 40 per year. This was after what Dr. Hotez refers to as the miracle of vaccines. In 1985, the first vaccine for HIB was licensed and administered via the FDA to children and toddlers. This was just the first of many that would be a long success story of American vaccines. The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, consults with the CDC and aids in introducing new vaccines to the general public. The ACIP advocates for cost-effective, well-researched vaccines. The cost of vaccines in the 1990s was one of the major impediments to widespread vaccination. To combat this, the United States implemented the Vaccines for Children program, which provided free ACIP vaccines to uninsured children. This system for vaccine access has all but eliminated many once common and fatal childhood diseases, such as diphtheria, tetanus, rubella, pertussis, rotavirus infection, and 9 more. The United States vaccination system had global influence and led to the creation of the expanded program on immunizations, which ultimately led to the first worldwide eradication of a disease, smallpox. EPI was wildly successful compared to what had been going on in the past, but more could be done. This is when, in 2000, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization came into the picture. Gavi had more financial backing than EPI did, and could then bring together multinational pharmaceutical companies and facilitate exchange between public and private enterprises. Gavi was able to distribute vaccines with little or no charge to countries with low or middle income. By 2016, Gavi had saved more than 9 million lives. According to Hotez, there is no question that Gavi represents one of the greatest public health success stories of this new century. Chapter 3 focuses back on Rachel and discusses in more detail her diagnosis and what life was like for the young Hotez family. Rachel's mother, Anne, was the first to notice something was not quite the same with Rachel as was with her other children. In infancy, Rachel did not mold to Anne's contours the way her other child, Dan, did. However, Rachel's growth seemed normal in her first year, but soon developmental delays began to appear. When Rachel was diagnosed, Peter and Anne describe an immense feeling of guilt for not noticing sooner. but also an unwillingness to accept the diagnosis, especially the cognitive delays that come with it. Rachel's verbal skills were very good, as was her verbal IQ, which made it difficult for her parents to process her performance IQ of 60, sometimes less. Rachel's childhood was filled with doctors, caregivers, and psychiatrists. As she got older and more mobile, the disappearances began, and Dr. Hotez had to sacrifice parts of his professional life to be home and closer to the family. Rachel's diagnosis had an effect on every part of family life. Home was hectic, and no one got the attention they felt they deserved. Rachel's needs always came first. This chapter explains the evolution of the anti-vaccine movement, the first of which was in the 1700s, when Reverend Cotton Mather arguably created the first immunizations using variolation. During this time, many believed that this process violated natural laws, leading to extreme backlash for Reverend Mather, including bomb threats. This would be the beginning of the anti-vaccine movement that lives on today. In 1998, the infamous Wakeland et al. Study was published in The Lancet and available on PubMed. This study, conducted on 12 children, 9 of whom had autism, sought to link the MMR vaccine, colonic inflammation, and autism. It was proven false and retracted in 2010. Despite this, the sensational claims of the study live on. Today, PubMed lists more than 700 papers using the words vaccine and autism as subject headings, with all but one of them appearing after the publication of the Wakeland et al. Paper in 1998. Another idea that seeks to derail the vaccine train today is the idea of vaccine schedules. Dr. Robert Sears is a large proponent of this vaccine criticism. According to Sears, children are giving too many vaccines too fast, leading to antigenic overload. This claim goes against the recommendations of the CDC and the ACIP and has little, if any, research backing it. Many parents are taking this advice seriously and asking their pediatricians for more limited vaccine schedules. This leaves gaps in vaccine coverage for at-risk children, leaving open the possibility for childhood outbreaks of once eradicated diseases. Dr. Hotez says of the current anti-vaccine movement, "It is a movement whose members are mostly unconcerned with scientific evidence, or if they are, they would be selective and piece together fragments of facts to construct a pseudoscience narrative."
In Chapter 5, Hotez discusses Rachel's adolescence. Their family makes an interesting discovery that despite her autism, she is very strong in her verbal skills. Hotez says this can be a common trait among girls with ASD, while boys tend to have more typical features of the autism spectrum. Rachel's psychologist, Dr. Goldberg, says Rachel is both outgoing and emotive. Rachel is capable of becoming flamboyantly melodramatic. They also found that Rachel has a very difficult time dealing with negative feedback, opposition, or difficult tasks. She runs away from such tasks and shuts down, which makes it difficult for her to find professional work. Hotez says these behaviors took a great toll on himself and his wife, Anne. He says they had a hard time maintaining good relationships with teachers and those who worked with Rachel. As he concludes the chapter, Hotez introduces his new school of tropical medicine he launched in Texas. He found Texas to be the perfect place for his research due to the large number of immigrants and diversity within the state. He says there is great poverty in the area with a high level of transmission of tropical ailments. While the poverty is not a good thing, it is perfect for his studies as he doesn't have to leave the United States to study tropical diseases. Additionally, it was right next to Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine, which provided him additional assistance and resources. With these resources, Hotez was able to greatly expand the number of vaccines being developed. Chapter 6 centers around measles. Measles is covered in our MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, and is one of the most contagious diseases. They use a number to describe transmissibility called the reproductive number, and measles scores in the 12 to 18 range, quite high. Because it's so contagious, Hotez says, perhaps more than other childhood illnesses, measles is one of the best indicators for drops in vaccine use among the population. If it gets out, measles will spread quickly, and current vaccination rates become apparent based upon how quickly the disease spreads. In order to keep it under control, he says vaccine coverage must exceed 90 to 95%. After the MMR vaccine was developed, measles infections plummeted and were completely eradicated by 2000. However, this did not last. In 2006, cases began popping up again. Hotez says the reappearances are due to non-medical exemptions from school vaccination requirements. Interestingly, he found that parents with anti-vaccine leanings often live in wealthier communities and have the education and means to actively search the internet and follow one or more of the many anti-vaccine websites. He says wealthier parents have the time to put in this research, as well as means and connections to get their opinions out and heard. In 2010, there was a large measles outbreak in California at Disneyland, which put an end to the non-medical exemptions, after which an immediate decline in measles took effect. Hotez discusses similar outbreaks in Minnesota and Texas, but he is particularly passionate about reasoning behind the decline in vaccination in Texas. A movie, Vaxxed, From Cover-Up to Catastrophe, was released right before the measles outbreak. He says, the movie attempts to strongly tie autism to vaccinations, especially the MMR vaccine, but it also alleges a vast conspiracy cover-up by the CDC to hide its links with pharmaceutical companies. Throughout the novel, we hear Hotez complain about this film, as he feels it's entirely dishonest and a large reason why children are not getting vaccinated today in the US. Finally, Hotez discusses his worry about the anti-vaccine movement reaching areas outside of the US. Yes, it is an issue here, but he worries that it could devolve into reductions in vaccine coverage in areas that are especially vulnerable to measles. A substantive action is needed now to prevent this. We can't just turn a blind eye. In Chapter 7, Hotez discusses Rachel's schooling. Although he says high school was difficult due to her non-compliances, Rachel graduated Lamar High School. Here, she also met her first friend, Sabina. He says they connected well over common obsessions. After high school, Rachel attended a special needs program at the Houston Community College. This education ended shortly after it began, as Rachel could not handle the classroom environment and was moving backwards. Hotez says this was immensely disappointing for himself and his wife, Anne, as this limited her professional future. As for her living situation, Hotez says they tried the center, but this was short-lived as Rachel began stealing and walking around by herself at night, which clearly is not working. Instead, she's been living at home, enjoying Montrose, as she takes morning bagel walks and can settle into a set routine. Hotez says she spends her days taking walks, meeting people and dogs along the way, who she is quick to spark up conversation with. Hotez also discusses Rachel's compulsive behaviors and extreme curiosity. He says she will approach random strangers on the streets to question them, and when there is something coming up on her schedule, he says Rachel will relentlessly call, confirming the event is still happening. While Rachel has a set schedule for every day that seems to be working for her, her parents worry quite a bit about where this will advance her in life and what career she can pursue. They discuss Goodwill as being a possible option, as they say that Goodwill has an amazing desire to help people with special needs. To begin Chapter 8, Hotez briefly discusses what he calls the anti-poverty vaccine. Basically, this is developing vaccines for diseases that aren't prevalent in the US, but highly prevalent in low-income countries where there are not vaccine research efforts. He says there's little or no financial remuneration for vaccines so that publicly owned companies would not be able to make money for their shareholders. While these companies are unwilling to take on the responsibility as there is no financial reward, he says his company is more than willing and this is his passion. Hotez spends the remainder of the chapter discussing why vaccines do not cause autism. He references countless studies that deny any link between autism and vaccination. One study provided strong evidence against the hypothesis that MMR vaccination causes autism. In addition, he says there is no temporal clustering of autism cases following immunization. Finally, he discusses a study that disproved an association between autism and an older sibling diagnosed with autism. He says there is a common assertion made by anti-vaccine groups that the children at risk of autism are the ones likely to actually develop autism as a result of vaccination. Hotez says this simply is not true. In this chapter, Hotez also disproves the link between thimerosal and autism. In the past, thimerosal was part of vaccines, but there were predictions of a link between it and autism. Studies were performed comparing autism rates with vaccinations containing thimerosal and then with the removal of thimerosal, and Hotez says the removal did not produce a decrease in autism rates. Instead, they actually found an increase in autism rates after the discontinuation. Hotez concludes this chapter clearly stating there is no connection between vaccination and autism. Nevertheless, he says anti-vaccine groups still attempt to refute these findings in interesting ways, such as trying to find mistakes in the methodologies or even resorting to conspiracy theories stating that the papers are fake news.
This chapter discusses the scientific evidence of how autism comes to be. And so there's a wide variety of conditions in autism, and there's a spectrum that defines the high-functioning side of autism disorder, which is also known as Asperger's syndrome, or the more severe autistic disorder. On an MRI scan of the brain, the volume in an autistic child is overgrown. and there are changes in the brain from the fetal stages of development, even before vaccines are even given. They believe that there's up to 1,000 different genes that may be involved in autism, and only 65 of them right now have been found. Other things that play a role are epigenetics and the prenatal environment that the child develops through.
Okay.
In Chapter 10, Dr. Hotez discusses the CDC finding that says that there is no adverse associations between antigens received through vaccines in the first 2 years of life and the neuropsychology. In Chapter 11, Dr. Hotez finishes off Rachel's story as of now. She is now 25 years old, and their family is cautiously excited about an opportunity to work at Goodwill. She's going through job training right now. The special needs and attention that she requires are required for the rest of her life. In Chapter 12, the final chapter of this book, Dr. Hotez discusses the anti-vaccine lobby and how the anti-vaccine lobby, despite the evidence, is persuading a generation of parents to not vaccinate their children through fake news, half-truths, and conspiracy theories. He blames two things. He blames others and ourselves in the form of the scientific community. In first blaming others, he mentions the United States government and blames them for being silent about the importance of vaccines by only giving out a few statements, if ever, and how they need to speak out more. And secondly, in blaming ourselves. And he gears this towards the scientific community as being reluctant to engage the public in a meaningful way to counteract this. So lastly, he discusses the science tikkun, which is defined as the overarching framework for science diplomacy and public engagement, thus thinking about the public engagement through science. Lastly, he discusses vaccine diplomacy, which he defines as the branch of global health diplomacy that relies on the use or delivery of vaccines, while vaccine science diplomacy is a unique hybrid of global health and science diplomacy.
So we read Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism by Dr. Peter J. Hotez. So what was something that you guys really liked about the book that resonated with you?
Yeah, I think the part that stood out to me the most was just kind of how he was talking about how a lot of people are following this anti-vaccine movement, but like they don't really know what's really behind it. And so that kind of stood out to me, was like that lack of awareness, that lack of knowledge, like causing like less children to be getting vaccinated, more children getting sick. And so just kind of seeing that stood out to me.
Yeah, mine is similar. I think it's interesting the trust that people put into what their pediatricians are saying. My own pediatrician, when I was younger, he pushed this as well and wrote books about why you should not do vaccination, or he formulated actually his own schedule for vaccination. So he was partially in support of it, but had this different schedule that has actually been proven does not work out well and is less beneficial than the original vaccination schedule. And I think that a lot of parents, especially if they have no interest in medicine or vaccinations or anything of that sort, they have no motivation to study that for themselves, other than, of course, they want their own children's well-being. But if you have someone like a pediatrician who is in this place of power, and you know they're much more educated than you, then I think it's easy to trust them and just trust them without thinking much about it. So I think there's kind of this mislevel of power within the vaccination and pediatricians pushing against it that needs to be addressed.
It's like a really sad dichotomy of the people who are already disadvantaged are like getting the short end of the stick again when their pediatricians are telling them to not vaccinate their children, or when they just hear from people around them. And I think it's especially disheartening to me because these are people who are preyed on by the system a lot. And this is like the CDC and like the people who want you to vaccinate their children. They're not the ones preying on you, but they just have this mindset that people are out to get them. And so like this scheme of like the CDC like trying to get you, and like I think it's like sad how vulnerable they are to that because that's what they're used to. So it's like
I kind of fall under that. A lot of people that I know within the Romanian community that I'm part of are also like in that same boat where they think sometimes that the CDC is out to get them, or you know, that vaccines are just meant to kill you pretty much, like in the most simplest terms. And so seeing that and then being someone in that community that supports vaccines because of what I see in the science and what I've learned from all the classes that we take, you know, here at SPU and in our science majors and as professionals, it shocks me to see that, you know, how much fear they have towards such a topic and the fact that the conversation isn't even going because it's like something you don't even want to talk about anymore. It's like health is not something we want to discuss. So
yeah, and that's something that I think we, as if we want to be health professionals, need to be aware of. That lots of people have this extreme distrust towards what health professionals want them to do, and I think that's something we need to really be aware of.
Yeah, there just needs to be more general education available for everyone, and I think made in an easier terminology than what doctors can understand, because a lot of general public don't understand the research articles that are put out. So I think a more general, easy to understand, kind of layman's term education on vaccination, so that parents can make their own informed decisions and not just immediately trust whatever their pediatrician's saying.
Yeah, or like news articles that we find online or blog posts that can motivate people.
And you kind of discuss in the book that like scientists and doctors have an obligation to like reach out to the public because like the people who are saying the most extreme things are always the loudest, and they always put like the most out there because they want people to believe what they're saying. And so scientists and doctors have an obligation to educate the public about what they know to be true based on the actual facts, not the pseudoscience, because that's how pseudoscience gets so pervasive in these communities.
So what did you guys find to be the most interesting point, something that stuck out to you or really surprised you about the book?
I like the history, honestly. That was very interesting to me because I never knew like the history of vaccines and like where the anti-vaccine movement started. And so that was really interesting to me. I think it was like chapter 4 or something.
3 or 4.
Yeah.
And I think we all kind of know like the bits and pieces of like the original article and like things like that, but I guess I didn't realize how recent vaccines really became prevalent. Like in our lifetimes is when vaccines became, like when the CDC got behind vaccines and like when all these organizations and vaccines were developed. I didn't realize it was like so recent, and like our parents are one of the first generations of parents who even had to deal with this question of, do I vaccinate my children? I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I found actually what we were just talking about, how scientists need to speak up and get their opinions out there. I found that to be something that was interesting. It was something that I hadn't really thought about, because you always think of a scientist as just this researcher in the lab doing their thing, and they're doing all the work behind it, and then other people will get the word out. But we have to be careful that the people that are getting the word out are getting the correct word out and what the scientist wanted to be said out. And so I think that's an interesting transformation. It'll be interesting to see if we do make that transformation over the next 50 years. But something that I hadn't really thought of before that is very important.
Okay, and lastly, like, is there any critiques you have on the book? Anything you guys want to criticize? Be open, be free to criticize.
There were a few things that we've kind of discussed that we didn't love. Primarily what bothered me about the book was just the way that the author discussed treating his child with autism. It seemed to me like he was kind of describing just something that was really burdensome on his life, and he just kind of talked about her in terms of like a case study or a science experiment, and I didn't really see like a fatherly, paternal like love when he talked about her, and it just felt like she was a major inconvenience to his life, and it just kind of made me like sad for her, and it like made me feel like she was a little exploited, and it made me sad that her quality of life and like the value of her life seemed to be less.
I would agree with I would agree with what you said, and he did say that he got her permission, but I felt like he went beyond what maybe her definition of permission would be like, and I noticed that he didn't really focus on a ton of positive things in her life, because I'm sure there have been a lot of positive experiences, but he seemed to kind of downplay what the good has been in her life and focus only on the bad, and like you said, the burden that was on his life. So I think he could have focused a lot more on the positivity. And then this is a small thing, but I found it to be pretty repetitive in terms of some of the chapters where he was going over articles either disproving or proving the link between autism and vaccines. He would go over multiple studies, which I understand that he's reinforcing that there is no link, so I understand that, but I think he could have been a little bit less repetitive in his writing and reasoning.
Yeah, it kind of shows, like, it makes him seem almost like less trusting because he's like so on the defensive about like this topic.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's kind of what I got too out of it. I kind of wanted to cry for Rachel.
Yeah.
Because I was like, oh, like, you moved to Texas just because of her, because you couldn't pursue your career in Washington, D.C. I was like, well, she's your daughter, like, you know, your own child. And I would add to that is, I kind of felt like the book didn't really address people that might be like suspicious about vaccines or really don't know. I felt like it was more for an educated person, someone who kind of knew a little bit more. And so someone reading it that might be like a skeptic might not really be convinced by the end. Yeah. At least that's how I felt. What do you guys think?
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that he really didn't address that other perspective. And then additionally, for people who are trying to understand vaccines, specifically parents who are worried about, is this good for my child, is it not, they don't have something available to them.
Kind of like vilified the people he was trying to empathize with and trying to convince. Like, you're not going to convince someone by making them look like the bad guy. Like, I think it would have been a more effective rhetorical strategy to empathize with the people and understand you're trying to look out for the well-being of your child just like I am, and this is where you may be going wrong, and let me help you to make like your child better, rather than just like basically calling like enemies of science and like it like didn't feel right.
Maybe that wasn't his goal, but I
it
felt like
wasn't his goal,
that's
I'm
what
sure,
I kind of was expecting though after the first chapter. I was expecting it to, you know, be very like descriptive, like empathetic to, you know, people that are believing what the anti-vaccine movement is saying. And so that kind of just like was like, oh, well, good book, but you know, it wouldn't convince, you know, someone I know.
And especially people who aren't as rooted in science, who don't have like a college education in science, like some of the words and phrases that he used also would not be very conducive to that.
Yeah, and I think the general population who need to know about these things are parents who have kids and are trying to make this decision, and majority of those people may be college educated, but they, like you're saying, they don't have that kind of scientific background to understand what he's saying, and need something that's more in layman's term that is easier for them to understand, and so they can find their own grasp on it and make their own decision versus just hearing what my doctor says and this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Good job, guys.
Yeah, overall I thought it was a pretty good book with lots of really good facts in it, I thought.
Yeah.
Very informative.
Yeah.
Good job.
Thanks, guys.
Good job.